morning. How you guys doing? So, bad news, I'm not a storyteller. Sorry, I'm an entrepreneur. I do have a story to tell, and it's a story, to sort of paraphrase Mike Tyson, about what happens when you have a plan and you get hit in the face. You know, you guys have all heard that quote from Mike. And I'd also like to talk about, to continue the boxing kind of metaphor, how I ended up getting in the ring in the first place. And I know a lot of you guys are involved in education, and at the end I hope to have a few minutes left to go back and talk about how I managed to get into the entrepreneurial track. I wasn't birthed fully formed as an entrepreneur who raised, you know, tens of millions of dollars and has been trying to transform regional air travel over the course of the last 13 years. But to get started, I wanted to bring up on the screen here the first page of the Harvard Business School case that was written about linear air just about 10 years ago. In fact, I presented at BIF 3 on this business model 10 years ago. I had learned to fly, became a pilot, had been an entrepreneur working in the internet days back in 96 through 2000 or so, and became aware of a small class of new jets that were being developed, literally billions of dollars being poured into the development of these jets. The main one of which was a company called Eclipse Aviation, started by some guys who had been at Microsoft, so very tech savvy, also were able to get a lot of capital. They raised about $1.5 billion to produce these new small jets that were leveraging sort of a step function advance in engine technology to bring down the size of a small jet engine so that jets themselves could be scaled down. So these new jets were 4-passenger jets, kind of like riding in a nice SUV or a luxury automobile. And there were a lot of folks who were sort of thinking about how to utilize these jets. And if you can read this while you listen to me, congratulations, you're one of those rare multitaskers we hear so much about. But there were a couple of other guys who were thinking about running fleets of these jets, one of whom was Bob Crandall, whose name you may recognize. He was the chairman and CEO of American Airlines for many years. And another guy was this guy, Ed Iacobucci, who started a company called Citrix Systems, which you may know about, a very large tech company. Obviously, a little different than little old Linear Air and Bill Herp, who had, you know, a little bit of a cred in terms of raising some capital and building businesses previously, but not at the same scale as these guys. So the case study here is basically, how is Linear Air going to compete with the likes of these huge, you know, titans of industry who are going to bring lots of capital and lots of credibility to their own resources. And in fact, our strategy was, well, let's just sort of ride their coattails. Let's get in there and be able to leverage what we know about using the internet to build and maintain customer relationships and take smaller risks. So where Ed Iacobucci had raised $70 million to start Dayjet and had a commitment for $150 million in financing to buy jets, we had raised $10 million, and we got started with a proxy aircraft. And our model was sort of traditional charter, where someone charters the whole airplane. The proxy aircraft being one that had a similar cost profile, so we could offer trips to our customers at about the same price on our proxy aircraft as we expected they would have the ability to use the Eclipse jet in the future. So we got into business and we got started. And then 2008 came along and everything went away. 2008, the global financial crisis came along. Eclipse went bankrupt. They went out of business after $1.5 billion spent. They had delivered 250 airplanes, of which we had 4, and Dayjet had 24. Pogo never got off the ground. That was Bob Crandall's company. They had filed an S-1, a registration statement with the SEC to raise $100 million in an IPO to kind of get themselves going. Obviously, they shelved that. Mr. Crandall retired to Gloucester. And so there we were, no coattails to ride. And at that point, we had been punched in the face, you know, to have that analogy, or really another piece of the anatomy, really, if you think about it. So we were sort of left with, you know, what do we do? You know, do we follow suit and just, you know, kind of roll up our tent and kind of go away? But we sort of looked at what we had, which was an experience, by the way, born of my prior company experience, starting an internet marketing company in the late 90s. Some of you are probably old enough to remember that time and how the internet bubble burst, and in that company, we went from 145 employees to 50 over the course of a couple of rounds. The first round of layoffs was 85, and everyone thought we were cutting way too deep. 2 months later, we cut 35 more people and went down to 50. managed to kind of keep things going there. We had 3 years in that business where our top line was 7 million, 7 million, 7 million, losing 13 and then getting to break even. So going through the experience of making that sort of a transition was something that I was able to bring to the table in 2008 when Linear Air and the air taxi business needed to go through its own sort of restructuring and repivoting. So we went from 45 employees down to 7. We turned our pilots into contractors. We had financed our airplanes, not with a large commercial leasing company, but with individuals. So we went to those individuals and said, bad news, you have a choice. Here are the keys, or we can turn you into a charter management client, which is the primary means of financing charter aircraft in the world. Basically meaning that someone owns an aircraft, they use it for their own purposes, they need someone with specialized expertise to manage it, and then when they're not using it, they can let it out for charter and sort of to offset those costs. So we had the ability to do that where some of the other competitors, Dayjet in particular, did not. They were financed by United Technologies that just sort of took all the airplanes back and said, well, that's nothing ventured, nothing gained. Sorry, you guys are out of business. So we had basically our plan before we got into the ring and were punched in the face, had the ability to sort of withstand that. So we had set up our initial strategy to be able to survive this. And so we sort of muddled along for a couple of years, still thinking that there was this opportunity to create this air taxi business, to provide the kind of benefits that's all talked about in the introduction. Basically, bringing the cost of a private air travel experience down to a level that could be justified against really airline travel or driving. And in the intervening period between 2008 and 2012, the technical advances in small aircraft continued to march along, and small propeller-driven airplanes that are even less expensive to fly than the VLJs and the Eclipse jet continued to develop their capabilities. So for example, every propeller airplane produced by every manufacturer today has what's called a glass cockpit. And that means that all of those old pitot-static air pressure-driven instruments of old have been replaced by 2 computer screens, which it's basically Microsoft Flight Simulator, but it's real. And by having computers in the airplane, you've got the ability to bring a lot more technology to bear. So you can bring in satellite weather, you can bring in traffic displays, you can have ground proximity, you can tie the autopilots together. So these small airplanes are much more capable, even in the last 10 years than they were before that. Tying in autopilots and so forth. And so what we saw was that many of these airplanes are being flown commercially under the charter rules, about 1,500 of them, in fact. So in 2012, we went to our investors and said, you're never going to get your 10 million back on the business model that we have. However, we have an idea. We have a pivot strategy, and that strategy is to take the technology platform that we had created for ourselves to build and maintain customer relationships and process transactions, put it into a new company, turn that into a marketplace platform, have the ownership of the new company be based upon the contribution of the assets from the old company, plus some new capital that came in. We needed some additional capital to then develop that into a real platform. And so today, if you go to linearair.com, you see that we have a marketplace platform that has lots and lots of different options. So I just ran this the other day. It's a Providence to Ithaca trip. It'd be exemplar of the kind of trip that our customers would be buying from us. It's the kind of trip that's regional in nature. It's a really difficult drive. It's a really difficult airline flight if you want to do it. And with 2 or 3 or 4 people traveling, you can bring the price point down to, well, listen, it happens to be $1,100, but on a 3 per person on a 3-person basis. But we typically will see it in the neighborhood of $800 or $900 per person, which, while expensive compared to the airlines, I mean, it's not private jet money. Private jet money would be $10,000, $15,000 as opposed to a couple $1,000 for this. And so over the course of the last few years, we've been able to incrementally, again, sort of conservatively invest a couple of $1 million of new investor money. And now we've got all 1,500 of these airplanes in the United States into our marketplace. We've connected the other side of the marketplace to the way in which people normally buy travel. I mean, how many people used an internet travel site, to arrange their travel to here if people came from out of town? So basically everyone, right? So that's the way in which people buy travel. And so to sort of fish where the fish are, we've had to connect our marketplace platform to those internet travel sites. So we've been on Kayak and another smaller site called Hipmunk for a couple of years. But to really get into that, you have to fit into what are called global distribution systems that all the travel providers, airlines, rental cars, hotels, cruise lines, they feed their data through these global distribution systems for further distribution out to offline travel agents and online travel agents like Expedia, Orbitz, Travelocity, and so forth. And it's a little bit of a square peg round hole because all that data for the airlines is based on scheduled flights and selling seats, where what we're selling is whole planes sort of on demand. We figured out how to do that with Kayak, and after an 18-month development cycle, literally this week, we were the first ever air charter company, to be connected up through the GDSs. So 2018 is going to potentially be a significant increase in growth for us as we go from having limited access through Kayak to very expanded access through all of the potential distribution channels. And this has the potential to be a multi-billion-dollar marketplace. There are about $140 billion that gets spent in the United States on air travel every year. And regional trips of this nature for which people are sort of willing to spend a premium based upon current airline spending for full coach, business, and first class is about 10 to 20 billion, depending upon which numbers you like, but we only need a billion or so of that. So it's a very large market opportunity, and it's one that hasn't been able to be tackled previously, and I think it's primarily because of these technical connections. So, I imagine very few of you are probably aware that, you could charter a small prop-driven airplane to get you, from one place to another, and that lack of awareness has been, what we've been able to sort of address by making these technical connections and getting it set up. So as a result of that, we've made the Inc. 500 this year based on our 4 past years. We're actually number 244 on the list. Pretty proud of that. And we're in the process of going out and raising a first round of institutional capital to talk about, how we grow this thing even further. So, that's that story. I mean, I thought about coming up and apologizing even more about just being an entrepreneur as opposed to someone with an amazing, emotional, heart-rending story like all of what we've heard, this morning and over the last couple of days. And, but so I sort of started thinking about a little bit more expansively, kind of, as I said at the outset, kind of how I got in the ring, right? And how I got to the point where, I was able to be an entrepreneur. And so I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s with the space program, that's how I sort of cultivated my passion for aviation. And, my dad was a postman. I had 4 brothers. I went to Catholic school. And when I was in high school, I got connected with a program called Junior Achievement. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Junior Achievement. JA is almost 100 years old. It'll be 100 years old in 2 years. And it's basically a program around, extracurricular, trying to teach kids, all ages now, but when I was in it, it was focused on high school, about free enterprise and capitalism. And in those days, it was mostly about what was called the company program. So advisors would come in from a company, and they would work with kids, and they would kind of help them create a company and run it over the course of a semester or a year. And that really sort of opened my eyes to the potential, right? My dad was a postman. I was going to school with guys that probably weren't going to go to college. And it opened my eyes to the possibilities that, hey, I could be an entrepreneur. I could start a company and be involved in this. And another sort of real point of inflection happened for me in high school when one of the teachers there, it was a Catholic school, they were taught by the same order that teaches at Notre Dame. No one from my high school had ever gone to Notre Dame. And this particular teacher said, why don't you go to Notre Dame? I was like, well, I'm going to go to U of L like everybody else, right? And he said, no, let's go up and check it out and see if you, and so I ended up going to Notre Dame, which was a huge another like putting me into, propelling me to another level. After I graduated from ND with the classic entrepreneur's degree of accounting, I decided that my thinking there was that accounting is sort of the language of business, and so it actually has been pretty good to be able to sort of read a financial statement and be able to make projections and so forth. But I spent a couple of years sort of, working for Price Waterhouse, now Price Waterhouse Coopers, and I got a phone call one day from one of my friends from high school. We didn't go to high school together, but I met him through Junior Achievement. He was at Harvard Law School. He said, Billy, if you don't like what you're doing, why don't you apply to Harvard Business School? I was like, well, that sounds easy, right? So he said, I tell you what, if I walk across the river and have him send you an application, will you fill it out? And I was like, well, sure. So I did at the very last possible minute. I didn't get in the first time. I was waitlisted, which was actually a good thing because in the intervening 1-year period, I met my wife, and so that's been a good thing too. Leaving that off to the side for the time being, I got into Harvard Business School. I came out to Boston, and after I graduated in 1989, I was then able to, with all of that sort of behind me, to put myself on the entrepreneurial track. And I've been successful and lucky in making additional connections over that time to be able to raise capital and put ideas out there and be in disruptive industries and be able to push ideas forward. The things that have kept me going during the downturns have really been thinking about my commitments to those people who supported me and how they instilled in me the passion to kind of move forward. And so as I looked at the people who were in attendance here and your involvement in education and in government, I wanted to just tell my story about how I kind of got to be here. And thank you for your continuing commitment and urge you to continue on. So, guys like Talik yesterday, when he got a standing ovation, it made me, brought me back to my days of that sort of thing, and it really, filled me with gratitude and with pride, and I really appreciate what you guys did for him yesterday, and I know he appreciates it too. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.